The 2023 movie season will be remembered for two things. Number one, Barbenheimer, Barbie just blowing up expectations, becoming a worldwide phenomenon, basically outside of Asia. Let's not go so far. It didn't do so great in a lot of Asian places, and it was banned kind of late, but it still made a ton of money. Oppenheimer, for a movie about a historical figure, made a whole lot more money than anyone could have anticipated, basically dominated the news cycle for quite some time, but it will also be remembered for a ton of movies losing a shitload of money. And I do mean we might have two or three of the biggest box office flops of all times, including likely the biggest box office flop of all time, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. I make no claims as to the quality of the films. I have not seen these movies. I live in a small town in the Philippines that has no movie theater. So I don't get to see the movies unless I go on vacation with my wife and kids, and then it has to be a kid-friendly movie because I'm likely to see it with my 8-year-old, but I do talk about pop culture, and we have got to talk about the enormous losses that were taken earlier in the year, and there's a recent article from Variety.com which is underselling just how much money these movies have lost. Specifically, we're going to talk about Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, Fast X, as well as The Flash. Although the Variety article doesn't actually mention The Flash, but it just finished up its theatrical run, and I wanted to take a look at that as well because I feel like it's part of the story. These films lost a ton of money, and it's being way undersold in this Variety article for reasons I'm not really clear on. Do they just not want to admit how badly these movies performed and how much money they lost? I don't know. Before we get into that, let's talk about some of the assumptions that we have to take into account when it comes to box office revenue. Compare that to production budgets and marketing budgets and things of that nature. Generally speaking, when you go out there and research this, at the domestic box office, a studio makes about 55% of the revenue taken in during a movie's theatrical run. It does vary a little bit from film to film because the contracts basically are done for each film individually for the most part, but the number is right about 55%. That is the industry standard that is accepted when it comes to domestic revenue, when it comes to movies. Overseas, it gets a little bit more murky. The number drops to 20 to 40% because it changes based on the revenues and there's tariffs involved. Like a country like China, where you always hear about the box office success there. In China, if your movie does great, it doesn't matter as much as it would if it did great in England, because movie studios actually make a smaller percentage of the box office revenues than China than anywhere else in the world. And those are just the facts. And it's between 20 and 40%. So when I look at a movie's overall box office, you have to assume, and I'm being very generous on this, for the most part, it's about a 50% ratio as far as what the studios are taking home from ticket sales worldwide, 55% domestic, in between 20 and 40% overseas. It's probably more likely to be 45%, but I go with 50 because it's a nice even number and it's easier to work with. So we are being a little bit generous. Now keep that in mind when you hear these numbers and this reporting from Variety, which is absolutely ridiculous and hilarious, equal parts of both. Indy 5, which opened in late June, has grossed $375 million globally after 6 weeks of release, while Mission Impossible 7, which debuted in July, has generated $523 million after 5 weeks of release. Those ticket sales are respectable in the current movie-going landscape, especially because the films are part of decades-old properties aimed at older audiences. The trouble is that each sequel costs roughly $300 million before marketing spends of at least $100 million, making them among the most expensive movies of all time. After falling short of expectations, they could lose nearly $100 million in their theatrical runs, according to sources familiar with the financials of similar productions. So let me get this right. You're saying Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which made $375 million, and Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, which made $523 million, or $150 more, at least today, than Indiana Jones, cost the exact same amount of money to make, the same amount of money to do marketing for, and they're both going to lose $100 million each. How the fuck does that even work? Think about what you're writing when you say something like that. One movie generated $150 million more in revenue than the other would. They cost the same amount to make and market, yet they're both going to lose the exact same amount of money? That's the most ridiculous, stupid thing I've ever read in an article whatsoever. And Variety is normally better than this. They're normally a pretty good source for this stuff, but for some reason, they're like fudging the numbers and act like people don't know what like theatrical movie math is. So let's take this. So going by their numbers of production budgets of $300 million that we know of, with marketing budgets of $100 million, which is far less than they really are, but let's just go with that number. Both movies cost $400 million to make. We'll be very nice and generous about this. With the 50% number, because we know the studios don't get 100% of revenue, they get 55% of domestic, 20 to 40% of overseas revenue. They would need to make $800 million each to break even. That's if their production budgets are really only $300 million. And we know both films had excessive amounts of reshoots, which cost more money and weren't in the original production budgets. And their marketing costs were likely well over $100 million, closer to $200 million. But let's go with the $400 million number that they're trying to play with here. So if Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny has grossed $375 million globally, that means it has made about $190 million of take-home money versus $400 million. That means it's losing at a minimum $210 million, right? That's a whole lot of cheddar. And I don't believe the $100 million marketing budget, and we know that the $300 million production budget is bullshit. Going by the Mission Impossible number, $523 million. That's about $265 million of take-home money, just being generous with it, which means it lost or is likely to lose $135 million. And that's if the production budget was only $300 million and the marketing budget was $100 million, which last we absolutely know is bullshit. They are certainly both going to lose a lot more than $100 million each. How could two movies that had $150 million discrepancy in revenue lose the same amount of money, Variety? Like, think about what you're writing. As for Dead Reckoning Part 1, sources familiar with the movie's financial modeling say that it will break even if it can hit $600 million at the global box office. That would be over the film's entire run, factoring in home entertainment and licensing revenue, and would include Cruise's share of the growth. He remains one of the few stars who still gets contractual bonuses before a film is out of the red. So right there, with that statement, we know that Mission Impossible is actually going to lose more money because Tom Cruise hasn't gotten his take home, even though the movie didn't make money. And yeah, they're saying, well, factoring in home entertainment licensing, I guess that's video on demand. I guess they don't really do Blu-rays and DVDs so much anymore, but you know, back in the day, they would have actually made some money on these movies after the fact by licensing them off to another streamer. But obviously, Disney's not going to do that with Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. It's going to go on to Disney Plus as they continue to hemorrhage money off there and never actually generate any money on there as well. Now, obviously, Mission Impossible being a part of Paramount, I imagine it goes on to Paramount Plus, or is it Universal? Whatever. If it's Universal, it's going to go on to Peacock or whatever, and they're never going to get as much money as they should have. The idea that every movie studio and television studio in the world needed to have their own exclusive streaming, like, this is one of the stupidest things in the world. You took on so much more risk than you ever needed to. And like I said, Variety's just here fudging the numbers, acting like we don't know how much money movies need to break even anymore. They go on to talk about Fast X. The stark reality is that blockbusters face a treacherous path to profitability. Take Universal's high-octane Fast X, whose production budget was $340 million. Despite earning $704 million at the global box office this summer, that film barely crawled into the black and will post a modest profit, according to sources familiar with its financing. So the budget is $340 million, and we're being very generous here with the 50% number. That means it needed to make $700 million globally just for the production budget, which is essentially what it did. It still had a marketing budget, assholes. It's another $200 million probably for a movie as big as Fast X, which isn't even like a domestic product anymore. It's more of an overseas franchise. And at that means it actually probably had to make more money because so much more of its revenue actually comes specifically from Asia and China itself. It probably needed to make like, oh my goodness, it probably needed to make $1.1 billion or something insane like that. Now, it wasn't completely everybody's fault that these production budgets got so enormous. I mean, they were far too big to begin with. That's absolutely, no one can disagree with that one. But the pandemic did happen, and they ended up incurring a lot more costs on top of the production because of the COVID shutdown. So in all likelihood, if COVID didn't happen, I imagine Mission Impossible probably breaks even. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny still loses money. Flash still loses money. And perhaps Fast X, doesn't lose anybody. But all these movies, like, they absolutely lost money because the budgets were so big, and they still had enormous marketing budgets. Like, I don't understand why Variety is even reporting this. The last thing I'll talk about is The Flash. It's not in the article, but it just ended its theatrical run and is going to go down as one of the biggest losers of all time, likely slotting right behind Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. The Flash officially ended its box office run yesterday. The final tally is $268 million worldwide. Ouch. Will we ever see Ezra Miller on screen? The Flash budget is said to have been around $220 million. So Warner Brothers is looking at some major losses here. The marketing campaign was $150 million. Add it all up, and it probably stands to lose over $100 million. Once again, underselling just how much money this is actually losing. So we'll go with the $150 marketing budget to go with the $220 million production budget. That's $370 million. It needed to make $740 million worldwide, and it made $268 million. Of that 268, we'll use the 50% number. It ends up being $134 million of take home against $370 million of actual production and marketing budget itself, right? Like, think about the numbers. It lost like $240 million. It's the number 2 biggest losing movie of all times, and it's going to slot right behind Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. I don't know why everyone's kind of like talking around this. Hey, you got the big win. You know, Warner Brothers, yes, they had The Flash and it lost a lot of money, but they had Barbie and it made a lot of money. And these things always have a way of evening themselves out. But I do believe 2023 is going to live on in infamy with 3 of the biggest box office flops of all times. We're talking about Indiana Jones, The Flash, and probably Fast X, to be completely honest. And if you would like to compare these enormous losing films to what have happened in previous years, I actually made a movie about how Disney ruled the box office flops in 2022, breaking them all down, and what Disney had to do with all of these as well. If you don't see the video here, there's also a link in the video description.